jump in whenever. So I've got to say a big thank you to Eduardo, who unfortunately isn't here, I don't think, who really put these slides together. So there was a point made in the previous presentation by creative tensions. We went beyond creative tensions. We had a full-blown existential crisis right at the start in terms of trying to work out, why are we doing this and what's the point? So we're closest to the original Drexler vision in terms of, can we do atom by atom or bond by bond assembly? And the thing is, since nanosystems back in the, whenever it was, early 90s, late 80s, well, I'll come back to this in a second, but the issue is this. It's amazing what chemists can do these days with just wet chemistry. There's a whole range. These are from theory, but I'm sure many of you, if not all of you in the audience, are familiar with Oliver Sartis's work, with Wendy's work. Oliver Sartis was at Berkeley, is now at Chicago, but Wendy's at MIT, Chad Merkin's work, in terms of making a wide range of different structures, core shell nanoparticles, nanorods, controlling the growth kinetics to get a huge family of these structures. And the question we started off with was, you know, if we want to build these type of structures, for example, atom by atom with an STM, is why bother? If wet chemical synthesis can do that for us, why bother? Why bother trying to build this atom by atom? And I think what we came down to in the end is that what we can do with the with scanning probes, which is not possible with wet chemical synthesis, which by definition is stochastic. You're controlling growth kinetics, but ultimately you don't have precise position of where every atom goes. We can, for example, build a nanoparticle and say it's all made out of silicon or it's all made out of carbon or whatever, but at position, as I mentioned yesterday, 777 in that lattice, we can put an atom in a particular position. And that has immense implications in terms of, for example, inhomogeneous broadening, in terms of line shapes, in terms of widths of lines, in terms of, hate to say it because everything obviously links to quantum computing, but in terms of environmental influence and inhomogeneous broadening when it comes to computing architectures, plays a big role. So let me skip back. So we thought of a number of different things. There was a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, a lot of hand-wringing. And ultimately, as was mentioned yesterday, the problem is we need better tooltips and we need better chemistry. We need to control the chemistry of the tips a hell of a lot better than what happens at the moment, which is brute force, smashing tips into surfaces repeatedly, hoping we get one atom in the right position, and then once we've got that, trying to pick up and functionalize that tip. But there's an awful lot of brute force involved in it. So, desired capacity, as you can see, build atom by atom our heterogeneous functional structure. And as I said, by heterogeneous, that could mean something like we've got a particle which is 99.999% silicon apart from one atom at a particular place. Assembly out of smaller self-assembling parts, well, it's a question of what we mean by that. We could take nanoparticles that we are built with the scanning probe, and then if those surfaces are, for example, hydrogen passivated, then rely on van der Waals interactions, or even somehow engineer stronger, perhaps covalent interactions. And again, then it's a question of hierarchy of length scales, and as been mentioned a couple of times before, can we have these different complementary techniques coming together? Okay, building quantum computers is possibly a little bit of a stretch, but still. Molecular machines in the sense of, ultimately, let's go back to nanosystems. And you know, could we, and this is from Mark's, remind me who did this?
Philip Turner, a student at Virginia Tech, who did these simulations. And this is a model of a piston inside of a casing with super lubricity, so there is very low friction as it moves in and out. And this was some validation work that Philip was doing in order to show both Drexler's concept of super lubricity, that it would work, and there's interesting results that we might get publishable out of this.
And trying to do something like that with wet chemical synthesis might be a little bit challenging. So, and ultimately...
But one point I would like to make about that image, though, is that it is unlike what we see here, which are large strained ring structures. These kinds of simple crystallic molecules are stable at every point during their synthesis, unlike most of the stuff that is inside of nanosystems. And so these are the kinds of things that we could conceivably have a pathway towards manufacturing. And there has been insufficient work to date on studying these kinds of materials.
Yeah. I think this is a good point. It was raised yesterday, and I think it's a really good point. Ultimately, if we want to put an atom in this position, and it's a position defined by us, I think we have to be kinetically limited, or heavily kinetically limited. Of course, there's been some wonderful work with encoding different interactions via DNA, etc. But ultimately, if we want precise control of the atomic positions, we do need to be kinetically limited. So many, many examples of things we can't build with conventional wet chemical synthesis. The problem is, before we get to these lofty heights, we really need to think about just how we're going to engineer tips. And I think that's ultimately what we'd like to do as a sort of seed project, or as a proof of principle would be, can we build up a nanoparticle with tips that we control the chemistry of in a rather more precise manner than just crashing them into surfaces. And I think that's really the focus of what we're trying to do here. Please jump in, everybody else. Yeah, go on.
I also wanted to jump in with a point. So part of the problems, even with even conventional wet nanochemistry, is just that usually what you can assemble are convex particles. So they have convex shapes. And so one has to think about, how would we actually go from, so even if we use those chemistries, how would we go from those shapes to these kinds of non-convex shapes that you would need to actually have robots. And so as far as I know, we were showing some of Sharon Glatzer's work, which is very well-known work on what kinds of shapes you can get. People have mostly used those to look at like quasi-crystalline structures or other kinds of phases, but nobody's ever really said, how do you self-assemble to get to the kinds of gears or shafts or whatever assemblies that we would need to have real nanomachinery. And so that's an open problem. And so Philip was kind of pointing at, you would probably need kinetic control to be able to make many of those things, because they're asymmetric. They're not the natural free energy minimum, most likely, of many structures. But that's underexplored. And actually that's both a theory thing, but then experimentally, how would we get to that? And why that's important is because we can't make these huge structures right off the bat right now, but you can make smaller structures and then try to assemble them.
Thank you. That was expressed so much more eloquently than I ever could. Thank you. So, yeah, I think the key thing is this, as Brenda's just said, this stepping stone goal. We're trying to go, if we work on these very simple three-dimensional objects initially, make sure that we can build those before we try to move on to these complex gear structures. But ultimately, those complex gears, those complex machines are what we're aiming for. The problem is we have to crawl before we can walk. Oh, 1 minute. Unless, do you want to?
I think we can take questions.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, guys. Well, let's start with general questions before we do a sweep up with the discussion problems. Anyone, questions, comments? You floored people here. Behind you, Ben.
I guess, is there actually a concrete thing that you can do with a dopant in 3 atoms?
Dopant in 3 atoms.
Or dopant in 2 atoms?
Right.
Like, so the stepping stone, like, yes, it's. Can you? Is it useful for like? Is there anything, or is it just like, look, we can do the thing?
Yes. So that's not an accident, that requirement there. And the idea is not that you just have 3 atoms and a dopant, but that you have a regular array. Every 3 atoms, you have a dopant of a particular type.
So how many atoms do you need to do something?
This is particularly
functional?
interesting. There's work that's been funded by the DOE looking at either nitrogen-doped diamond or phosphorus-doped silicon as a substrate for quantum computation. And that was work that was done with Zyvex Labs and some collaborators in Australia, I believe. But this capability would, in principle, be a way in which you can build reliable quantum computers at scale if you could scale up the process.
Right. So I'm saying ignore the scale. Like what is actually like the minimum functional thing that you can do with this?
Well, I mean, I think being able to demonstrate that the theory for these quantum computers works in the lab as well as in the DFT simulations would be useful. So I do think that is a deliverable. And even on smaller scales than millions of qubits, you can still have quantum computers be useful. But
Right.
it is also possible that these kind of regular placements could allow you to do things like create functional tips at the end of a probe that could be used for either testing surfaces or manipulating surfaces in a better way.
I think maybe a question is like, how many of these do you need to have a qubit? I think is kind of the question. If I understand correctly.
So qubit is one stretch goal from my perspective, but many of us, so Phil and I have spent a lot of time on thinking about even what clusters do, and so it's actually a hard problem for clusters of atoms. If you have a dopant or you have an asymmetric cluster, they have very different properties than other types of clusters, and so people look at this all the time. And so why would someone be interested in even a small cluster that's asymmetric? So if you put magnetic atoms in, then you can actually have different types of magnetic fields, which could be useful for self-assembly processes. So now if you have a bunch of little magnets that have slight asymmetries, they will assemble in different ways than if you didn't have those things. And so if you're talking about sizes there, sizes for those kinds of things, I mean, Phil might have other opinions, but you start to look at things that are interesting at the level of even 8-atom kind of clusters. You have to have like an inside and an outside, otherwise it starts not being meaningful.
Yeah, it's like it still feels like it has a chicken and egg problem, right?
I sort of agree, but I think the key thing is to get these basic steps in. And really, it's not that there's going to be a killer app from these basic steps.
Yeah.
It's aiming towards a much more long-term goal.
I guess
This was
So
the
it's really difficult to sell to funding bodies.
This was the existential crisis he mentioned that we had,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
we're effectively, with poor technology, replicating what chemical synthesis can already do, and that we referenced at the very beginning when we talked about those polyhedra shapes that can be manufactured, which are far more complex than 3 or 4 atoms in precise positions. However, there is always going to be a limit to what stochastic self-assembly can accomplish in terms of complexity. And if you're talking about very large nanomechanical systems, there has to be some sort of pick-and-place positional assembly going on. And that's what this approach is enabling.
Okay, I think we have time for probably one more. Okay, over there.
Yeah, I have more of a fundamental question because I'm not very familiar with the field. What happens after, let's say, that you're able to form these structures atomically precise, if they are just held together by van der Waals interactions or other type? How do you make sure that they just don't collapse? Because
Absolutely. That's a great question. If you've got something that's just kinetically limited,
Yeah,
and you heat it
exactly.
up and it gets the energy to get out of that, but that's a very, very good question. So that's why I work at 4 Kelvin all the time.
So that's
Indeed,
how-
all those beautiful Cromie experiments where you form the quantum corrals that we've all seen, heat that surface up to 20K and that falls apart.
Oh wow!
So right here on this image, we've got a piston going back and forth. There's nothing inside. But where the simulation started was with the piston on the outside, and the van der Waals interaction brought it into the tube. Now, you can make use of that by putting reactive surfaces on the inside, so the piston gets sucked in, and when it hits the end, reactive sites on that piston hit the end, and now it's covalently bonded. These are the kinds of things that you could do to assemble larger structures. You don't have to have your scanning probe microscope be able to pick this thing up and put it precisely where it needs to be. You just need to get it close enough that the van der Waals interactions will suck it into where it needs to be to do its assembly.
Okay, okay, final question.
Are these structures by necessity always on a surface? Because here it's floating, but
We had a long discussion. We had a long discussion about that. Yeah, if it's scanning probe, it needs a substrate. And therefore it's a question of how you get it off the substrate, how do you engineer it? Can you form structures which, if you think of a nanoparticle, is actually sitting on a point, is it sitting on an edge? Can you get sufficient van der Waals, integrated van der Waals interactions to break whatever covalent interaction if it's a single bond versus a large van der Waals interaction? That's a great question. We thought about that a lot.
Because otherwise you have the piston and the block like just glued to the surface. They'll never
They're all
assemble,
synthesized
right?
on the surface, but yes, you need mechanisms by which you can break them off
Yeah.
the surface. And typically that would be done by having a much weaker bond to the surface. So these are all diamond for a reason, because diamond is ridiculously strong. And if the bond to the surface is with some other material, then you can break it off without breaking the part itself.
That
in
was an
theory.
early existential crisis. There's a brilliant Yeats quote, which I love in terms of existential crises, which is, being Irish, he had an abiding sense of tragedy that sustained him through temporary periods of joy.
Wow. David.
Thank you.
Thank you.